Hello and good afternoon or good evening to everyone. My name is Paul Rosen and I serve as the Executive Chairman of GlobalGo, the cannabis industry's leading global advisory. I've been an entrepreneur and an executive in the regulated cannabis industry since 2012, and I've been an enthusiast for cannabis as a healing plant since 1978. I am continually awed and delighted by how quickly the cannabis industry has transitioned itself from a basement industry mired in controversy to a global concern, transforming the health and wellness of hundreds of millions of patients and citizens across the planet, while also providing a much needed economic boost to regional economies all over the world. On behalf of GlobalGo and our partner, the African Cannabis Advisory Group, welcome again to our webinar series. Today's topic is On the Ground, Lessons and Insights from African Cannabis Operators. Noteworthy, this is GlobalGo's second webinar featuring Africa, a continent that we believe is going to have an outsized role in the development of the global cannabis industry. The African cannabis industry has made great strides over the last few years, now beginning to slowly integrate into the global cannabis ecosystem. Despite capital, operational, economic, and regulatory challenges, many of these pioneering businesses are now operating and beginning to take shape. With the growing number of corporations, entrepreneurs, investors, and institutions looking to enter the market, the need to better understand the process of commercialization has never been more urgent than it is today. Today's webinar brings together some of the leading African cannabis entrepreneurs and unpacks their experiences in founding cannabis businesses in Africa. Our panel shares insights gained from their often long and arduous, capital-intensive and complicated process of entering the cannabis industry at scale. The panel will also discuss some of the more valuable lessons they've learned in raising capital, recruiting talent, adhering to compliance, developing brands, and exporting products both locally and internationally. Before we get to today's exciting program, I would like to ask all attendees, in lieu of a webinar registration fee, to please consider making a donation of either 100 Rand or 10 pounds to Fields of Green for All. For those of you that know Fields of Green for All, you'll know that the devastating loss of one of their founders, Jules Stobbs, to an act of senseless violence during a house robbery just a few short months ago has impacted every corner of the cannabis community, both in South Africa and frankly abroad. Jules was a man who would have been angered if we gave up the fight to free this beloved plant from the clutches of prohibition. The fire is burning and the resolve for cannabis reform has never been stronger. Fields of Green needs all the support and backing they can get to move the industry forward in South Africa. With the help of Dabstars, Field of Greens has decided to run a crowdfunding campaign to raise money to fuel their resolve to continue on a cannabis legalization journey in South Africa. Okay, let's get on to our program. I am thrilled to welcome today's guest speaker, Ms. Thobile Desemelo. Thobile is a researcher at Social Surveys Institute. She is also the lead researcher on the National Cannabis Survey at Social Surveys, which GlobalGo and African Cannabis Advisory have sponsored. Thobile studied communication sciences with UNISA and has more than 10 years experience of working within the social development space. She is passionate about cannabis, as we all are, and the discourse around cannabis and indigenous communities of practice, and the creation of an active and inclusive industry for the cannabis economy within South Africa. Just by way of background, Social Surveys Africa is a social enterprise founded by Bev Russell in 1987, making them one of the oldest social research organizations in Southern Africa. The organization has a long history of supporting progressive social change, whether through direct local action or national policy change. Social Surveys has had over 300 clients in the last 32 years and over 500,000 participants in their research. They've had many prestigious clients, including the World Bank, the United Nations, the Presidency of South Africa, Oxford University, Johns Hopkins University, Oxfam, and Anglo Platinum. We are absolutely honored and delighted to have Thobile speak with us today about the National Cannabis Survey. Thobile, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Good morning to those of us who are joining us from distant lands. As Paul has said, my name is Lady Sumelo, and I'm going to present to you the results of an online survey that we conducted among South African suburban users and growers of cannabis. So I'm coming to you from a company called Social Surveys Africa. And I'm just trying to get my screen up. There you go. And I'll basically be giving you the results of the study that we've been running. Now, before I jump into the survey results, I'd like to give a big thank you to Myrtle Clark and Fields and of Green for All, who helped us to disseminate the questionnaire so wildly. I'd also like to thank Swisiswa Kaba and the ACA group, as well as Phil from Global Go, who both helped to sponsor this survey. I am a researcher and I work at a company called Social Surveys. And we've been running for the past 33 years, and we have experience in social research, research advocacy, and policy development. Now, from the moment that Judge Zondo gave his progressive ruling back in 2018, we've been trying to raise money to conduct a large nationally representative and in-depth study in order to determine the scope of the cannabis sector in South Africa. A study of this nature will form a critical evidence base for the development of a responsible and enabling cannabis policy. Now, the proposed cannabis bill that came out from the Justice Department earlier this year is clear proof that there is a dire need for relevant information, proper engagement, and public consultation if South Africa wants to develop any kind of a progressive cannabis economy and policy. The survey in itself is not representative of the whole country. Now, we achieved a sample of 2,043 suburban users and growers of cannabis. The sample is predominantly urban metro, and because of the online nature of the methodology, more than half of the respondents are middle class. Now, with this sample, we're able to gain some critical insight into the incredible potential that the sector represents, both in terms of potential job creation and also in terms of tax revenue and potential stimulus to the economy. We were unable to reach a critical constituency in the Rastafari community with indigenous farmers, traditional healers, and other local communities of practice. And they are critical in order for us to develop a local industry and a local market for cannabis in South Africa, and for us to also get a critical understanding of the players on the ground. Now, this is why it is so very important that we have a nationally representative survey that we can run in order for us to reach everyone and to help shape a cannabis policy that is representative and national. With the sample that we ran, we got a very good healthy number, 2,043. Now, many of the people who responded were from the Gauteng region, with a fairly good distribution coming in from the Western Cape, KZN, and the Eastern Cape. Now, when we look at race, the majority of the people who responded, 63% were white, 12% black, 10% colored, and 5% Asian. And it's interesting to note also that with the age range in the respondents that we got, in the age range, 33% were between the ages of 30 and 39, 22% between 18 and 25, which wasn't a big surprise there. 18% between 40 and 49, and 11% between 50 and 79. So this sort of dispels the myth of cannabis users being some kind of drugged out young hippie types. Now, in terms of their personal income, it is considerably higher than the national average, with 55% of our respondents earning 12,000 rands and above. So that was an interesting thing for us to note. Now, the myths around cannabis are that we're a bunch of drug addicts and a bunch of dropouts. But when you look at our personal income, almost 26% are earning 12,000 and above per month, 12,000 to 24,000. Only 7% of our entire sample is unemployed. And that is actually quite impressive when you look at the fact that we have close to 50% unemployment rate in South Africa. Now, 81% of our sample use cannabis on a daily basis, and 77% of the users in this sample started using in the past 5 years. Now, this is in line, I think, with international sort of trends in terms of cannabis use, and it might also have something to do with the Judge Zondo ruling. We don't know. Oh, and the average amount that is spent on cannabis per year in South Africa comes close to 50 million rand, because the average spent per month is 1,944 rand per user. This is very interesting to note, because then it tells us that there is actually a great potential for tax revenue if cannabis was legalized in South Africa. Many of the people that use cannabis use it specifically within the sample that we have, use it specifically for medicinal purposes, with 63% using it. Now, 94% of those who use cannabis for medicinal purposes would strongly recommend it to others to use. The majority of the ailments that they are treating with cannabis is inability to sleep, anxiety, and depression, followed closely by general pain and a whole list of other ailments. So we do have a vibrant sort of culture already in South Africa of people, and an established market within the middle class for cannabis products when it comes to medicinal cannabis. Now, in terms of growing cannabis, 71% of the sample that we drew grow their own cannabis, which is very interesting. I found this to be surprising because there's also a direct correlation between the socioeconomic status of the respondents and the number of plants that they grow. And this would probably have something to do with access to land, access to equipment, access to all the other paraphernalia that grow with being able to grow your own plants. Now, on average, those that earn 12,000 Rand and above grow about 309 plants, whereas those that grow between 1 Rand and 12,000 Rand grow on average about 46 plants each. Now, on average, 1 in 5 of the growers that we interviewed in the survey earn more than a quarter of their income from cannabis. So that was also interesting to note. And it's particularly an important finding in that it demonstrates the opportunity for us to have equitable access to land as a prerequisite and a very important thing in terms of how we view policy around cannabis in South Africa. We don't want to find ourselves replicating another unequal economy in South Africa with cannabis, where the majority of the people who use it, who want to use it, are not able to, which is what we are finding at the moment with the cannabis bill that seems to be very racist in nature and very classist in that it leaves out a lot of people. The potential jobs that legalizing cannabis would increase 30-fold in South Africa, because we found that on average, every grower employed about 3 people which accounted for 4,351 jobs. And this was just from the sample of 2,043 people alone. So if cannabis was fully legalized, the number of jobs that would create is actually, it's immeasurable. We've come up to 44,950 just based on the 2,043. Now, if we are able to run a study that is looking at the entire nation as a whole, we are going to find much better figures than this. In terms of our study, the majority of the people are growing their plants outdoors, with 83% growing outdoor, 49% growing indoor, and 22% growing either in a greenhouse or in a tunnel. Half of the sample indicated that they either sell, consult, or invest in the cannabis industry. 12% of them were consulting, 12% investing, and a full 34% were selling. Now, when asked how much they would invest if cannabis was legalized, the average investment was around 4,642,813. And this was if cannabis was legalized. And this number came from only about 549 of the respondents that we spoke to. That is a large number. 80% of the sample indicate that they would invest in cultivation, 37% in delivery of service, 46% in retail and manufacturing. Now, this obviously represents a huge opportunity for the country, and it indicates that we have got a very good appetite for investment in South Africa. 15% of this sample, unfortunately, because of the draconian laws that we have been arrested for cannabis. The majority were arrested for dealing, even though within the survey, the majority also indicated that they were growing purely for personal use. Now, on average, most of those who had been arrested twice and had suffered some form of police brutality, corruption, or theft of their possessions. And obviously the effect of being arrested for cannabis or anything at all is that you will have emotional distress. It has caused many to lose their jobs. They were disqualified from certain opportunities, or they've had their visas declined and are now unable to travel. The cannabis bill that was proposed has, within its propositions, a lot of limiting of the number of plants that can be grown. And there's strong resistance from the sample that we drew to this limiting of plants. Now, the biggest worry amongst our sample was that police would be invading their privacy on a regular basis just to count plants. And this goes directly against the whole point of private use. The other fear is that regulators don't understand how much cannabis a single person needs if they are a regular cannabis user, that regulators don't understand the different strains that can be different in size as well, and that they wouldn't even know the difference between a CBD strain and a THC strain, and there's just going to be a lot of confusion, legal confusion. And this will cause a lot of police intimidation and harassment, much more than there has ever been before. Cannabis is already being used to effectively treat a wide range of ailments across all age groups, and it's likely to grow with formalization and education. There's a large gap in the local cannabis community. And there's also a large gap about the potential local market. Now, public consultation is critical. There's also a strong resistance to limiting the number of plants that can be grown, and this is viewed as going against the very spirit of Judge Zondo's ruling to protect people's right to privacy. There's a strong, vibrant middle class cannabis sector, and this middle class cannabis sector is likely to invest heavily if cannabis is legalized. Employment in the sector could increase 30-fold if regulation is enabling. And the investment potential for cannabis from within this country is substantial. So this shows us that if we are able to conduct a nationally representative study, we can actually help government and help ourselves to build a very strong cannabis economy in South Africa. But in order for us to do this nationally representative study, we need your support as social surveys. Funding is required. Unfortunately, without your support, we won't be able to do it. It won't be possible. So we request that you generally support this critical initiative, because your support will help to ensure that our policies benefit everyone, particularly the man on the ground, because it's very, very critical and important for us to build a local market, a local economy for cannabis in this country. Anything else will just, I don't know, will be wasting a valuable resource that we have. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you all about our findings. And like we say at Social Surveys, knowledge is power, but understanding is everything. Thank you, Paul. Back to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Just waiting for that screen share to end. Hopefully it will end in a moment.
It will.
That's great. Hey, that was extremely illuminating, and I would say the opportunity as well as the challenges moving forward for the African industry could not be more self-evident. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm now thrilled to introduce our partner at Global Go and our good friend Sib Zaba, who is going to introduce today's keynote. Sibs has extensive experience with financial matters across Africa. He specializes in capital markets, deal structuring, venture capital fundraising, hedging solutions, and portfolio management. And over his career, Sibs has worked with African governments, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, pension funds, insurers, and asset managers, and has closed transactions worth over $5 billion. He's also a chartered financial analyst, and prior to joining and running the Global Go Africa office, Sibs worked as a banker at Goldman Sachs and Investec in London for over 8 years. He holds a business science degree from the University of Cape Town. I'm pleased to introduce Sib Zaba.
Thanks so much, Paul. Appreciate the kind introduction. As Paul mentioned, I'm the CEO of Africa Cannabis Advisory Group and also the CEO of Global Go Africa, our joint venture with Paul Rosen and the Global Go team in the US. We've had an incredible experience working with Global Go and hosting these webinars and expanding the set of services that we're offering in the African market. So couldn't be more delighted to be here today with Paul and very excited to have everyone joining us from across the globe. Perhaps just to kick things off on my side, firstly, Toile and the Social Surveys team, I think a massive thank you for the great work that you've done in this first phase of the National Cannabis Survey during what has been an exceptionally challenging year, you know, to sort of get people's attention and to really hone in on some of the work that you've been doing. I think we cannot underestimate the importance of this initiative in terms of really unpacking and understanding the industry at a granular level, where you know, a lot of the data and the information that we have is extrapolated and isn't quite reliable for a wide variety of stakeholders, including government, investors, industry participants, and regulators, and so forth. So very, very well done on this first phase, and we're excited for your continued work as you deep dive into this research, going into rural and indigenous communities, and hopefully expanding into other African countries as we see the legalization wave continue to rise. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Paul Michael Cashel, partner at Schindler's Attorneys. Schindler's Attorneys is a dynamic multidisciplinary law firm offering a full range of legal services to both corporates and individual clients in South Africa and the world. Schindler's have been experts in the cannabis field for over 5 years and rose to prominence in medicinal and recreational law beginning in 2013 when it took on the now very well-known Dagga couple as clients, leading their challenge to have laws prohibiting cannabis use and possession declared unconstitutional in South Africa. Paul Michael, an internationally recognized and respected partner in this area of practice, began his journey in professional cannabis industry quite early on, I think even before entering the job market, by writing his final year university dissertation on cannabis legalization and the potential for a constitutional challenge. Talk about vision. Which he has passionately pursued ever since, and which has led to the charge in the re-legalization of the plant. Not only is Paul Michael leading the constitutional challenge, but he is now advising international companies on how to ultimately navigate this complex landscape in South Africa. He's been involved in making representations to government on what may be a legitimate, practical, and easy to implement framework to regulate the cannabis industry in South Africa. Having won the applications to for leave to intervene on his client's behalf in the Constitutional Court, Schindler's briefed counsel to argue for the decriminalization of cannabis on behalf of the Dagga couple. To this end, and after a day of argument, Schindler's was successful in this bid. This was an internationally newsworthy judgment of the Constitutional Court and was handed down on the 18th of September 2018, which effectively decriminalized the private possession and use of cannabis in South Africa. This was a historically significant turning point in the cannabis industry, and will certainly go down as one of the key events when we look back on the development of the global cannabis industry. Paul Michael continues to play a pivotal role in cannabis legal reform, and most recently he's been working with clients involved in cannabis grow clubs in South Africa, which are being challenged by the criminal justice system. Paul Michael, we're honored to have you join us today and to share with us your unbelievable journey in the cannabis industry. Take it away, PM.
Thank you, Sibs. It's a real honor to be here, and good evening to everybody who's attending. Thank you for your time. Sibs, that was quite an introduction. Thank you very much. I think you've covered a lot of my introduction, at least. But let me start off by saying this, that insofar as I wrote that essay in my final year of law that ultimately had Jules Stobbs, the late great Jules Stobbs, and Myrtle Clark walk through my door as a young attorney in 2013, it was really an acknowledgement from what I knew in my studies up till that point, that while we have this ideal of participatory governance and government listening to its people and engaging with its people when it comes to policy and the implementation of policy, that just wasn't something that existed on the ground and in everyday reality. So I realized that the only way to make government listen was to sue them. And it was a perfect thing that the so-called Dagga couple walked through my door, because we had a meeting of minds and we realized that we needed to sue government and we needed to present all of the evidence for the harms and the benefits of cannabis to see whether our laws were reasonable, rational, and justifiable in a constitutional democracy that emphasizes the freedom of individuals as one of its foundational tenets. Now, we originally went to the Pretoria High Court, and our trial was rendered part heard. Unfortunately, the state played a little bit dirty and pulled a few naughty or mischievous tricks to make sure that the case didn't proceed. In the meantime, Gareth Prince and Jeremy Acton and a number of other applicants and plaintiffs had won their matter down in Cape Town, and they were going on appeal to the Constitutional Court. And that's when we intervened, and I think we contributed quite meaningfully to that judgment, although it would be incorrect of me to take any sort of full credit for that. There were many cogs in the great machine that achieved this, and we intervened at quite a late level or quite a late point, and I do think that we contributed meaningfully. Now, the Constitutional Court judgment, I'm sure a lot of the people on this webinar would have read it, or at least read summaries or media reports on the judgment. Now, we had gone to court, as had the other applicants, alleging various rights that had been infringed, various constitutional rights that had been infringed. But it turns out that the justices of the Constitutional Court elected to hang their hats on the right to privacy. Now, it was a means to an end, and it doesn't fully ventilate whether other rights are infringed by criminal prohibition of cannabis or other substances. But it was a means to an end, and it achieved a certain level of freedom. We're not all the way there, but we are certainly a decent distance along the way. And it does, of course, beg the question as to what else we can do in private, because as the Constitutional Court says, nobody kicks down your door to check whether you are part of a swingers club, whether you have too much alcohol, whether you have too much pornography for their liking. So it's this acknowledgement that what you do in private without harming other people or infringing upon their rights is something that is not the sphere of government intervention. So it may not stop at cannabis. We may carry on with things like medicinal mushrooms, other psychedelics, etc. It all comes down to freedom and what you are free to do in the privacy of your own space. But what it did do is it mandated a change to our law. It told government that it had 2 years in which to enact reactive legislation to make sure that our laws, our statutory laws, were aligned with the Constitution, which is the apex law of South Africa. Now, within those 2 years, there were a few steps along the way. One of the things that happened was certain reschedulings in terms of the Medicines Act. Without going into too much detail, CBD is now a little bit easier. It's the latest craze, although you do still need a license in terms of the Medicines Act to grow the cannabis, to produce, to extract, to wholesale. Ultimately, the storefront owner doesn't need a Section 22 license in terms of the Medicines Act, although it does beg the question as to how they obtained their cannabis along the supply chain. Hemp has also been reclassified, as it were. Presumably that's going to go to away from SAHPRA, that's the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, and into the hands of the Department of Agriculture. That, I think, is a very positive step, although the concentrations of the cannabinoids that are that allow something to be classified as hemp and not as cannabis, that's prohibited in terms of the Medicines or the Drugs Act, we would say are arbitrarily low and reflective of the fact that government doesn't really know what it's doing and is not engaging with the right experts. THC remains difficult. Of course, THC is what everybody's ultimately after. Some would say that it has higher therapeutic potential than CBD. All of these things are open to debate, but ultimately, some people just want to get stoned, and some people will say that they want to self-elevate instead of self-medicate, and that they don't need to be sick in order to be afforded the freedom to go to the shops and purchase cannabis, or go to their neighbor and purchase cannabis, or whatever the case may be. It remains in a higher schedule than CBD and obviously hemp, and there are strict controls in terms of the Medicines Act. It's very, very difficult, expensive, and burdensome to get yourself a license. Then, of course, we earlier this year were presented with the eagerly awaited Cannabis for Private Purposes bill. Initial optimism seems to have had some cold water poured over it, because just at a glance, it seems that government, having lost in the Constitutional Court, attempted to claw back on criminal prohibition. Instead of giving people more freedoms, they tried to sneakily take away some of the freedoms that had been won through going all the way to the Constitutional Court. It imposes what we would say are arbitrary limitations on the number of plants that people may possess, the concentrations that cause cannabis to be one thing and not another thing. And largely it's reflective, we say again, of a lack of understanding and, for that matter, consultation with the people who actually knew what they were talking about. Because of course, if you had done the consultation, you would have the understanding. At this stage, the bill creates no cannabis industry. It remains a crime to deal in cannabis, and the definition of dealing in cannabis has changed. But what a lot of people haven't realized is that the bill does talk of dealing being permissible if in terms of other acts of parliament which permit dealing. We already know that in certain limited circumstances, the Medicines and Related Substances Act does allow dealing in cannabis. Those are very limited circumstances, and it's very difficult to get the license. But if you have run the gauntlet, you can, strictly speaking, deal in cannabis. But it does beg the question as to whether there's potentially another act of parliament on the cards. Call it the Trade in Cannabis Act or whatever it is that it's ultimately going to be called. We don't know for a fact that Parliament has one of these in the works, and it would be really nice to know. But of course, that would involve Parliament and government engaging with the people who voted them into power. Ironically, and this was touched on by Tobile, the bill allows for the state-sanctioned invasion of privacy. The implementation of the bill would be that, presumably on the basis of a warrant, people would be able to, or police officers would be able to come into your house and count the number of plants that you have and test the concentrations of things and how much resin you have and this and that. All these things that they don't do with things like tobacco and alcohol. Nobody comes into your private residence, walks downstairs into your wine cellar and tells you that you've got too many bottles of Merlot in your cellar, or that for that matter, you have too many Cuban cigars down there. So cannabis keeps being treated as this evil with a failure to acknowledge that it is no more harmful. In fact, it is far less harmful than tobacco and alcohol and all manner of other things that we are allowed to do without the government coming down on us. And then again, and this is something that really doesn't sit well with me, is that it maintains a focus on prohibition via the criminal justice system. And this is in direct contradiction of the National Drug Master Plan. Now, this National Drug Master Plan was drafted on mandate by the very same government that has now put together the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill. So I've described government at the moment, at least in relation to cannabis, as this grand drunk octopus, where one tentacle is doing its own thing and it has absolutely no idea that the other tentacle is doing another contradictory movement. So that's where we are at the moment. I'm very mindful that I've got limited time, so I want to just conclude by saying where to from here. Well, it's interesting that the UN recently reclassified how it treats cannabis. It says that it's not as bad as we thought it was, and that there's an acknowledgement that it may be an effective medicine in certain instances. But what about people who aren't sick? Do they not have the right to self-elevate? There's also a focus, there ought to be a focus on harms reduction and not inadvertently doing more harm than you're preventing. As Tobile mentioned, it's incredibly traumatic to be arrested and to be dragged through the criminal justice system. Are those harms that befall an individual not in excess of the harms that you're preventing by keeping cannabis out of the hands of people? Now, we also need to recognize that depriving people of a viable industry is doing future harm. Tobile touched on this. This is depriving people of the ability to drag themselves out of poverty. Almost finished. I would suggest that we need to bring some empathy and human decency to the table. Who are the real victims of this so-called war on drugs? It's certainly not the drugs per se, but the drug users. So government really ought to drop this doublespeak and start acknowledging who is affected by their laws. And we ought not, for that matter, to punish victimless crimes. Finally, and most importantly, and I've touched on this before, government needs to consult with the people who the laws affect before putting pen to paper, because now we've got a draft cannabis bill that needs to be reworked. If you had consulted at the beginning, you might have had a product that wouldn't need so many revisions. And this is now, absent revisions, going to get fought again all the way up to the Constitutional Court. So please, government, start listening. And finally, free the plant. It has been in shackles for so long. It has been the cause, or the laws around it have been the cause of so much human suffering and misery. It is time to put that behind us and start moving forward with our eyes open, caring for drug users instead of punishing drug users. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was absolutely inspiring, Paul Michael. Free the plant. That's going to become my hashtag for the rest of the week. Could not agree more. What a wonderful overview. Thank you for your insights and your time today. Okay, we're going to move on to our panel now. And I just want to ask our attendees, hopefully you'll have questions, and to please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen in order to get to those questions, and we'll do our best to respond, time permitting. Our moderator for the panel this evening is Jeff Verlinden, a sales executive at Separations. Separations has been in the South African laboratory and pharmaceutical equipment supply and support space for the last 3 decades. Jeff, as a leading executive at the firm, has a passion for cannabis extraction and formulation workflows, along with all the necessary testing analytics to ensure the highest quality product ends up in the hands of consumers at all levels of use. Jeff has been a leading voice in the African cannabis industry, engaging operators, banks, SAPRA, and activists. As investment into extraction grows in coming years, Jeff and Separations will no doubt play a leading role in establishing this important industry for cannabis in Africa. Jeff, welcome. Take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. And thanks for the introduction. I have the pleasure this evening and this morning, depending where you are, of introducing our 4 panelists. And Sibs has been already introduced so friendly by Paul. So welcome on the panel, Sibs. I'd also like to introduce Philisande Mahlakata, the project coordinator of Zimvuba Farmer Support Network. Ultimately, an organization focused on providing support to rural farmers in the Zimvuba region in the Eastern Cape. She works closely with farmers, providing educational as well as networks and strategic guidance to the rural agricultural communities in the region. Phila is also, as she's commonly known, a chairperson of the Mufaze Wanholo Cultural Hub, an essential oils and natural cosmetic initiative that has developed a network of growers sourcing a broad range of essential oils producing for plants and final products that are ultimately targeted towards the export market. Phila also served as a member of the Eastern Cape Provincial Cannabis Steering Committee, assisting in providing insights related to Indigenous farmers and regulations. And the Provincial Steering Committee has also been initiated by the MEC of Rural Development and Agrarian Reform, advising government on how to build out the cannabis industry sustainably. In addition to Sibs and Phila, we have the pleasure of also having on the panel today Tony Budden. Tony Budden is a founding partner of Emporium South Africa, the premium hemp company out there. Emporium has obviously been pioneering in the space for industrial cannabis products since 1996. So Tony's no stranger to the audience out there today. He was also quite commonly known for the Africa's first hemp house, which was recognized as a World Design Capital initiative back in 2014. He's instrumental in launching hemp as a revolutionary new construction material in South Africa. Tony's also globally recognized as an industry expert leader. I've seen him also at committees like the D37 doing keynote addresses. For me, critical player in this space, and ultimately Tony's knowledge is highly valuable in terms of steering the movement of the cannabis initiatives forward. He's been involved in South Africa as well as Malawi's hemp research trials, is growing industrial cannabis under license and moving forward to a legitimate and interesting new space for the hemp industry. As Paul Michael had illustrated, we're looking forward to seeing how agriculture will deal with that and a valuable contributor to our panel today. Our final panelist is Dr. Buranwa Makwawera of Maluti Green Med. He's got a background in genetic engineering, which is quite interesting. Obviously a professional natural scientist with the South African Council of Natural Scientists. Dr. Makwarela's educational background obviously goes into genetic engineering of plants ranging from medicinal, forestry, and food crops. His career started out in academia as a researcher in cassava genetic engineering at the University of Witwatersrand. He lectured and was obviously supervising both undergrads and postgraduate students in the field of plant genetic engineering. He's applied that knowledge obviously in terms of cassava plant tissues, in terms of cells and embryos, using agrobacterium, tumefricaeus, and particle gun, which will be quite interesting to hear about. And Dr. Makwarera was involved in the gene bank division at the ARC, or the Agricultural Research Council, leading a team of scientists responsible for the conservation and maintenance of all South African vegetables and ornamental genetic resources. In addition to that, he's also been the HOD for Agriculture and Environmental Management at the city of Tshwane, our capital city in South Africa. And ultimately, he was busy with the CEO of Toll South Africa, which is a subsidiary of this Toll Group, which is a top water, wastewater, and agricultural civil engineering company based out of Israel. So welcome to our panelists, and I'd like to encourage anyone viewing to please get ready with any questions you might have for our panelists, but we'll have some set questions as well. And I think maybe Paul Rosen, would you like to kick us off on the questions?
Yeah, I will at the end of the panel, if there's time, I'm definitely going to reach into the Q&A button, which seems to be active. Hopefully we'll have some time. Thanks, Jeff. Please continue.
All right, perfect. So for SIBS, I think let's start out with a question for SIBS from our end. Obviously with the African Cannabis Advisory Group, you've dealt with a broad range of industry participants. What are some of the standout features you've seen that basically will increase the success of local cannabis operators?
Sure, thanks so much, Jeff. Appreciate those introductions. So from our perspective, having the opportunity to sort of have a bird's eye view on the industry, and I'd say at this point we probably had over 150 participants in the industry looking for services or capital. I think I'd say the number one most important feature, or let's say attribute in terms of founding teams, is a commitment and a discipline around research. So I think most of the people that come to ACA are people that are looking for capital, understandably so. There's a shortage of capital in this industry, and especially under this economic climate. But the individuals that kind of go out of their way to ensure that they actually truly understand the fundamentals of this industry, everything from sort of your cultivation to researching different operational models from companies that are established in different parts of the world, to sort of understanding pricing and the macro dynamics of the industry. I think that typically is the starting point that that we find kind of ensures that these standout companies are really well positioned. I'd also say you can't underestimate the importance of a strong team, and so doing the hard yards in sort of finding the right individuals to slot into the business, even if it takes you a little bit longer to set up your company, is probably very, very important in the way of ensuring the long-term success of your company. So, you'd rather, sweat a lot and take a much longer amount of time to assemble, to do your research and continue to be plugged into the industry, because of the ever-changing nature of this industry. It is a very, very new industry, and then the work around assembling a strong team. And then from there, I think things like capital raising become a lot easier for industry participants.
Good, excellent. And in terms of strong teams and long participation in the space, I guess I have a question for Tony next. In terms of, you've been an activist and an entrepreneur in the industry for well over 20 years, and what are some of the major milestones you've seen and things you've seen in the journey along the way with Emporium as well as Highlands?
Okay, well, obviously, yeah, since 1996, it feels like a lifetime ago, and for some in listening, it might be. It was over 25 years ago that we started, and at that stage, when we launched Emporium, we really thought that within 3 or 4 years, we'd be able to source everything that we were making out of South Africa. We'll be able to get the fiber and the food and the building materials all from South African farmers, and 25 years later, we're still importing from the east. We get all our fabrics from the east. We get CBD from Canada and States. We get hemp oil from Germany, and that. So for us, one of the big milestones after, it was around 2011, where we'd already been in it for 15 years. We developed over 2,000 different products, from fashion to footwear to building materials, all of that. And we got one of the first permits to do research on hemp. And I know there's a lot of, not so many people like the idea of these research permits, but being a recipient and being privileged enough to do that research, and just to be able to walk in the fields in Africa and be surrounded by the plant that we had been working with already for 15 years, that was a massive milestone for us. And we learned a lot in the 4 years that we grew, just understanding the difference between horticulture and agriculture. A lot of people understand this plant, one plant by one plant, and they're looking after each plant. But with hemp, you're looking at a field as an ecosystem, and just understanding that is very, very different levels of skills that are needed to run an agricultural operation than small scale medical or recreational grow. So that was a big milestone, is actually getting to plant the plant. this hemp house that I'm sitting in now, I've been in here 8 years. That was a major milestone, and was used as an introduction, obviously, to live in it, to feel it. We've got hemp carpets, hemp couches, curtains, insulation, hempcrete in the walls. So yes, being surrounded by the plant again, that has given me so much in my career, but also absolutely supporting me in my day-to-day life. That was a major milestone. And then contributing as an expert witness in the court cases, in the High Court case here with Jeremy Acton and Gareth Prince, and then obviously with Jules and Myrtle in the Gauteng High Court, that culminated in the Concord win, and getting to work with great people like Paul Michael. And that was a highlight of my career, being part of that, feeling the sensation that day when the ruling was read out in the Concord of the sensation of shackles being released, and a liberty for so many people that we'd fought so long and hard for. And we're still in that battle. As we said, it was a major win, but the battle's still on, and people are still getting arrested for this time. But that was a great milestone. And over that time, got to do a lot of more consultancy, because you can imagine being at the front, everyone now wants in. You're like, Tony, where am I going to get seeds from? How do I get a license? Who am I going to sell to? And all of a sudden, just had floods of emails and phone calls, and my business partners were like, Tony, you can't keep giving this information away for free. We've worked for like nearly 20 years to get all of this IP together, and you're just handing it out, free talks, interviews, whatever, consult. Tony, can I pick your brain? So I had that a lot, and I started doing some consultancies, and through that, got offered a role in a company called Highlands in Lesotho. And I went where my skills were needed. South Africa wasn't opening up yet, and Lesotho was creating an enabling environment for people to get licenses and actually grow medical and CBD varieties. And we started setting up a small business, and in the end got acquired by the biggest cannabis company in the world, which was Canopy Growth. So kind of got caught by the big fish, and caught the big fish, and worked with them for 2 years, building up the Lesotho business, getting experience at scale like we've never seen. I've been in some 16-hectare size greenhouses, run by 13.5 megawatts of power. Like just this scale that North America went into over the last few years. So getting to experience that and see a lot of the mistakes that were made that we can't make in South Africa. We can't afford to make the mistakes that Canada has made over the last few years. So learning on that being bigger is not always best. Getting things right, understanding the difference between capex and opex, and for the young entrepreneurs coming in, capex is your capital expenditure, how much you spend on your facility, but your opex is the most important part, because when you run out of that, you have to go back to look for more investors or more debt, and that's like being able to pay salaries, be able to buy plant food, to be able to buy more seeds. So important lessons. And then another milestone earlier, just before lockdown, we got our company back from the Canadians. We did a management buyout, and we're now rebuilding it as an entrepreneurial African business, but with significant assets and experience. So it's a very exciting space. And then also being part of the Malawian project up there, seeing that licenses are about to be given in Malawi. Our partner company up there, Invergrow, has done fantastic work, and just seeing these walls slowly crumble. So it's been a full career so far, but I still know there's a lot more work to do, which is quite important.
Perfect. Well, I mean, you have so much experience, which is such a great benefit to have on a panel like this. So I know we're going to have a lot of questions, and I encourage anyone out there with questions for Tony to pop them in the chat. And obviously, from that full experience of having experienced, the full spectrum of what I think the initial hemp licenses had their clear intent, and it's somewhat morphed, and perhaps it's going to morph back to what maybe the initial intent was, and how that's different from medical cannabis licensing. But I'd like to bring in Phyllis Sunday here at this point with a question, because she's obviously down on the ground in the Eastern Cape, and there's a big question with all this capital and international players that moved into Lesotho initially 2-3 years ago. What is your view in terms of how many rural and traditional farmers are currently perhaps not completely included? And what do you think needs to be happening in the cannabis space, and maybe also in the hemp space, which is perhaps more immediately possible, to be more inclusive for the general, as we saw in the social surveys earlier? How do we make it more inclusive while still hopefully maintaining good standards to protect the consumer out there? which is ultimately the goal of any kind of product that hits the consumer market. I think we have you on mute quickly.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Jeff, and greetings to everybody, to all the panelists and the attendees. And thank you for this opportunity to speak to you all as well on the perspective of the rural farmers whom we have been working closely with for the past 4 years as an organization, Umzimvubu Farmer Support Network. Historically, these are the people who have been harassed, who have been incarcerated. And I think that the cannabis subject within these spaces is a very sensitive one when we are talking of development of an industry, because you would think that maybe there would be some thought going into the history that the people have been through, the experiences that the rural people have been through, trying to make a living with the cannabis and being prohibited from either cultivating or possessing or using. So you would think that maybe there might be some effort or some thought to say, let's allow the rural farmers to maybe be first in line, or to have equal benefit from whatever may spring off from a developing industry that is to now do what people have been trying to do, which is making money for them, putting food on their table. Our history with the plant is that as an organization, Umzimvubu Farmer Support Network, how we first started working with the communities was basically just seeing that whole trouble that the communities were going through of being sprayed on by the South African police, who exerted this forced fumigation program on these areas along the Umzimvubu Valley. And these are the communities that are still pretty much clueless about the scope of the industry and what it could look like in the future. A lot of rural farmers are still scared and skeptical of the plant being decriminalized or allowed to, because they're thinking that that's going to take away that's going to take away the clientele that they've been servicing very successfully underground for all these years. And we've also got an issue of the plant being stigmatized. It's taken over 100 years to stigmatize the plant, and now all of a sudden you wake up one day and it's all systems go, and we are told that it is actually medicinal, which is what the rural people have been saying all along. So there's also that element of maybe undermining the existing indigenous knowledge. And I think it's very important that we incorporate whatever developments that may come up with regards to the overall industry, incorporate that with the existing knowledge, and as well include the rural farmers, the small scale farmers, in whatever is to be gained. And yeah, I think that it is very important that we acknowledge that. There's a fond name that cannabis is known as in Southern Africa, which is Ituba Labatwa, and that refers to it being the tobacco of the Khoisan people. And there is a lot of claim to the originalities of the plant and how people have been so close to it, either using it for medicinal purposes as well as for divining purposes. So all of that, before we can jump the gun and say, oh, yay, let's all be happy and create an industry. Just to give a little bit of respect to the history and what people have been through, I think would go a long way.
Perfect. I completely agree with that. And Look, in terms of inclusiveness, I mean, this has been the big debate, and, you know, engagement with government, engaging with the necessary stakeholders. How do we build out a system that gets to service multiple areas, from the high-end Western medicine model all the way to the more inclusive models, and potentially we look at recreational dietary supplement. I mean, ultimately, I look at the wine and tobacco industry, and you mentioned it, like, those are models that we can learn from those industries. We can learn how to work from the wine industry, where we have an agricultural product that goes through what would be a GMP type of facility for consumer good, is exported, meets quality standards, has a very good reputation internationally. And likewise with tobacco, there are models from similar industries that allow for a good degree of inclusion, and that needs to start being played into the space, along with the pharmaceutical side, which is going to have some stringency attached to it. And on the pharmaceutical side, this is where I'd like to bring in a question for Dr. Makwarela. Obviously, I'm very interested in your operations with Maluti Green Med. I recall the briefs, I think it was last year, with your engagement with some extractors out in Lesotho, some international news breaking in that space. Could you tell us a little bit more about the operations, obviously, at your facility, some of the milestones you've hit, so that the audience out there, I'm sure, in terms from hearing from a licensed producer in Lesotho, they'd love to hear some of your challenges over the last years.
Right, thank you very much, Jeff. Quite an honor really to participate in this forum, and ourselves actually representing a group of partners for Maluti Green Med. It's quite an important opportunity for us now to come out, because really when we started, we were quite small, and actually we were quite focused, very much limited in terms of resources. But over the time, we have managed to attract a huge capital investment, including the government of Lesotho. And we have managed to assemble a team of interesting young guys that are quite enthusiastic about the crop. And they've actually assimilated a lot of understanding and appreciation of, of the opportunity, that is arising from the cultivation and the manufacturing, the whole value chain that the cannabis crop, presents itself. So obviously when we started very small. We had very limited budget, because actually we relied on funds that we have actually assimilated, ourselves from our own pockets. And we went under the radar, but then we actually worked our butts off. And, we really managed to get where we are at the moment. And obviously, one of the biggest challenges that every small, company that is actually venturing into this space, like we have already seen in Lesotho, there's a lot of actually expectation and, interest that was actually shown in numerous companies in Lesotho, and some were just pretty startups from nowhere, because people thought it was going to be easy, to just jump on board and get going. But then obviously capital was one of the limiting factors, if not one of the huge bottlenecks that everybody has experienced, including ourselves. So really from our side, what we have really actually observed is that it is very important to really make sure that you get a seasoned investment banker from the onset. You don't just go into this industry without, really relying on the expertise, from the people that have been there, in other sectors that have managed to actually put together capital that is so much important for your operations. So that's basically where we started. That's the first step. And we actually have liaised, even with the people like Tony Baden himself, really. And one of my colleagues, Vincent Clarkson, actually has been an understudy of Tony Baden for years. And we used to siphon a lot of information through Vincent, liaising with Tony Baden out, and many other people actually from Canada. Actually, I don't want to give away our investment banker really, but he hails all the way from Canada, so he actually understood the Canadian market pretty much. So we were quite lucky in that regard. And then the second thing is to be conservative with, assumptions and forecasts. As you would know, what happened in Canada, people were very much optimistic about the industry, and they actually threw in big numbers, expecting that this thing is just gonna catch fire and go like that. So obviously a lot of people were disappointed. So you know what actually happened in Canada. So we started pretty small and we managed our expectations very well because we wanted, you know, to deal with first thing first. That is actually to manage the plant and ensure that we know exactly what we're up to ourselves. And then the second thing, obviously, the third thing rather that I want people to understand out there is to understand the markets. Just like any other agricultural venture, you don't want to enter into this space without necessarily knowing your market. That is the first thing. Why are you in the business? Who are you cultivating for? And what is your unique selling points? So Maluti Green Med, as a small company, we actually defined from the onset our unique selling point, which was in particular cultivation, because we knew that actually to set up a facility that is you know, compliant in terms of cultivation wouldn't be too costly for that matter, vis-a-vis setting up a manufacturing on an extraction facility, because that would actually cost an arm and a leg. So we started by defining our unique selling you know, point, which was cultivation. And the situation as it were right now, I tell you that we have managed to actually understand the crop management. When I talk of crop management, I'm talking about the cultivation methods, I'm talking about the lighting conditions, I'm talking the watering regime, I'm talking about, you know, integrated pest management for that matter. So all these kind of things have come together to a point that we now understand what we are dealing with. We actually have appreciated the whole value chain to a point that actually we actually collaborated, you know, and interfaced with companies that already knew what they were doing in the market. So we didn't want to claim that we knew everything. Even up to date, we still liaise and form partnership, very strong partnership with, for instance, contract manufacturing companies around the world, and in particular in South Africa, that were already GMP approved in their operations. So we learned a lot. We invested in learning and acquiring knowledge before we actually throw ourselves into the deep end. And at the moment, it's not smooth sailing. There's still a lot of challenges, but we appreciate them as they come. But I can tell you, as the first speaker, should I say the second speaker actually, when she presented that knowledge is everything. So obviously we acquired knowledge and now we are becoming wise as we apply the knowledge that we have acquired to date. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Perfect. Yes. Well, I think you've got it there on the getting good teams together, understanding that I always struggle when someone says they're an expert in the cannabis space, because I mean, I would regard possibly Tony in that space, but I think Tony would agree that there's so much to learn, to keep learning. And this marketplace is moving and evolving so quickly. What the Canadian model was on cultivation and how maybe the Southern Hemisphere is approaching it differently. There's so much that's constantly changing and iterating and constantly upgrading in our knowledge space. And I like your comments on scale, because I often do deal with stakeholders where it's all big business, it's all big scale, but those are the operations that can run into a wall very quickly. So for me, I like that mentioning of a small, precise operation to be able to leverage that to be successful, because very often so much is changing so quickly that getting good knowledge and teams together has not been the easiest thing. And I've seen this from teams locally, engaging with dozens of them, that getting a good understanding, getting a good source of information such as this webinar is a vital starting point. I like to say people don't like to read. They really need to, because if it's hundreds of millions of rands that you want to invest, you need to make sure you know that. So on that regard, I mean, Sibs, just to bring you in on the global rapid changes in the industry, what recommendations do you have for operators in terms of navigating the international business space, the offtake agreements, getting accurate funding, dealing with things like registrations, you know, if it's a scheduled product, navigating that space versus navigating alternate models, all while waiting to hear for clarity from different government stakeholders? What advice do you have for those out there watching that are actively in the space already, and that some that might be looking to get into the space?
Like I've already indicated, Jeff, the most important thing, get a seasoned investment banker, because they would be able to put your whole, you know, scenario together and map it so well to a point that in the process of doing that, you also have to have an appreciation of the fact that, your assumptions in actually embarking into this business are well defined. So a seasoned banker, investment banker, will assist in that regard. And then lastly, as I've indicated, your unique selling point. The value chain is so wide. So people think that, you're going to just get a license, cultivate, manufacture, extract, isolate, and do all manner of things. And I can tell you that it's not an easy thing. You got to choose your sports. Like ourselves, as I have already indicated, we started small. And the most natural sport that we had to choose was cultivation, because, like, for instance, I'm a genetic engineer by profession, so I already come well endowed in terms of, the cultivation of crops, whether you're talking in situ conditions, ex situ conditions. I come from that background, so already I had a knowledge of the space. So it is very important to understand, Jeff, that you can't just do everything here in this whole industry. There are other people and experts that exist, and they've invested a lot of time, the likes of Tony Biden, for instance. He has been in this sector for a very long time. So you got to liaise with people like the Tonys of this world and choose your niche market and partner with these other people that have already developed and assailed their positions so much that they have bent their fingers enough that they have nothing left there. So for me, it's very much critical that you have a unique selling point. And in our case, it's cultivation, and we are actually scaling up as funds and capital become available.
No, perfect. I completely agree. Differentiate yourself in the marketplace. And I'd like to extend the question I asked you, Doctor, to Sibs as well as to Tony Biden as well, because you've both got a lot of experience in terms of the global industry and the trends out there. What advice do you have in terms of what should be considered getting in, and also in terms of everyone's talking about an early exit? It's too early. You have to have a passion for this to drive and formalize this industry, because I'm big on formalization. So Sibs, if we can hear your point of view on where it's going.
Yeah, so maybe just to unpack the international aspect of it, which I think is not easy. Obviously you're trying to start a business, and the likelihood is that you're going to have stakeholders in 3-4 different countries, and you're going to have to manage all kinds of aspects such as imports, capital, and so forth. So it's not easy at all. But I think it really, from my perspective, it boils down to kind of three key pillars that are essential to get that international aspect right. And and that's what I touched on earlier: research. Almost I can't emphasize this enough, because it's such a new industry that one blind spot can have a cost of millions of dollars if you raise capital, or can result in operational delays of a year or 2 years, for example, if you miss a season, and so forth. So that focus on sort of research and keeping a very close tab on how things are developing in different parts of the world, different markets, different deals that are happening, different community initiatives in other parts of the world. I think that's very key. Number two, something that sounds very simple but is often not as easy to do, is actually a healthy amount of networking. So both locally in terms of sort of industry participants, government regulators, get to know the individuals that are shaping this industry, but I think more importantly internationally. What I found when I started, before I started ACA, I kind of did an international research trip for about 4 months, spending time in markets like Israel, Canada, and Europe. And what I found is people globally are very, very keen to connect. A investor in the US, a manufacturer in Australia, a brand in the UK are very keen to connect with people from around the world, hear their stories, and try to figure out whether there's areas of collaboration. So I think a systematic and continuous way of networking, attending webinars such as this, getting to sort of map out what the industry looks like is very, very key. And lastly, and potentially most importantly, is around credibility. So this industry is, one of, there's a lot of hype around this industry. There's headlines that we see every day, multi-million and billion-dollar deals happening all the time, record sales in different parts of the world. But getting to a point where you have a credible story, team, narrative, and plan and strategy is exceptionally important. And then being able to communicate that with stakeholders allows you to, I think, be able to have an adult conversation with potential suppliers, potential buyers, potential strategic partners as well. So I would say those are some of the really sort of important pillars of sort of establishing yourself in this industry.
Perfect. Yeah, fully agreed. I mean, I like the point you raised on small $1 million mistakes. I think of things like the INCB limits. Those are things that are not often addressed, looked at, needs to be discussed if you want to successfully export. Hopefully that will slightly change with recent news on UN scheduling. So let's have a look how that all plays itself out. And I also like your point to credibility. You mentioned the words hype. And this is why I'd like to ask Tony's opinion on that same question, because that's someone I would take as someone very credible. He's been doing it for over 20 years. He wasn't in it for the money starting out. So I'd like to know from Tony's experience as well, what do you see, before we go over to Phyllis Sunday, and I probably have a different question for you, but in terms of your view, in terms of, people looking to get into the space, some advice, as well as addressing, what were the hard lessons that you picked up?
Okay, well, firstly, I would say develop quite a thick skin. It's an industry that's got a lot of hangers on, a lot of people who are just there to throw stones at people who are actually doing things. And it's you have to have this conviction of your path and what you're doing and believe in it. And yes, it's awesome to, as Sib said, to find like-minded people as well. And it still is a sharing industry. Majority of us who've been in it for a long time got in for altruistic reasons and because we really, really believe in this plant and are open to sharing and helping others. Obviously there's limited time in the day, but as much as we can, and reach out to people if you're wanting help. Don't be scared. I've got a huge network internationally, and it was built just by sending the odd email or pestering someone and getting some time, and it's easy. Especially with Africa being positioned where it is, we can take that benefit of a lot of people wanting to help us out and wanting to see us thrive. And hopefully we can really build on that technology transfer, because the big thing for me that I really want to see in South Africa at the moment is a move away from cultivation only being the aim. Everyone thinks, hey, I'm going to grow and we're going to grow the most and we're going to grow the best. And growing is just the first step. We have to develop local value chains, and we have to develop a local market. The idea that some magical Canadian is going to rock up on your doorstep once you've harvested and hand you a pile of dollars for your product, that's gone. That ship sailed, and the South African government, we unfortunately chased that ship away of being first in, where we could have taken advantage of it many years ago. And now we have to develop local industry, local market, local demand. It's there. We know the demand is there, and it's currently being fed through the black market, and we can bring that into the light with a bit of regulation, a little bit of the standards that we chatted about a bit earlier, like setting some standards, making sure that the products are produced well, they're safe, the claims that you put on your product are realistic. What's in the product is on the label, and what's on the label is in the product. And then we've got a real ability to grow an industry. We have to not fall into that same trap that South Africa has been in for a long time with our resources, of just being the primary supplier and sending it off somewhere else for someone else to make into an end product. And we have the skills here, we have the engineers, we have the extraction specialists, we have the product developers. I truly believe that will feed then into a local market where it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, where we have to bring the price down of the products in order to access the local market. But if we are growing here at scale, we can easily bring that price down. It's very easy to look at the price that people are growing. I'll just use CBD as an example. People are able to grow CBD and make distillate out of it. You can pick it up for $1,000 a kilo now in America. Now, if you look at what that actually costs to put that into a bottle of CBD, under 10 Rand for a 300 milligram product. Now that should be being sold for 250 or 300 Rand and everyone's making money. But the customer can then afford to do that every month. The moment, you know, people are being forced to pay 600, 700, 800 to 1,000 Rand for a small tincture, you'll use that 1 month or 2 months, and then you'll go, oh, hold on, I'm moving on to Moringa or whatever else, you know, like the next fad is. So we need to be able to offer value products at a fair price, you know, locally produced, and with that, obviously, we need the right legislation. So to continue lobbying, continue supporting people like Fields of Green for All, you join the associations. You're like, yes, the association sector is also full of complexities and politics and that, but there are, you know, there's CDCSA, there's CTAA, the Cannabis Trade Association of Africa. There's people who are really trying to get, you know, to collectivize our voice. And that's where the government also wakes up. And we're not coming as like one Mlungu from Cape Town, you know, speaking to them, but I'm coming with, you know, 100 people behind me who I'm speaking for, or you're like the power of the Eastern Cape farmers collectivizing as well. And that's where we'll really see a difference, I think, as we start trying to unify. I know there's a lot of vested interests, there's a lot of different you know, aspects that people are looking from, and that's a part of our beautiful country, and it's trying to find the common ground, which we're trying to build an industry that is Fields of Green for all, betterment for all, makes the product available, stop throwing people in cages for wanting to work with us or use it, and we will see an industry that can get Tito Mboweni what he wants, you know, that tax money, and get the industry to develop, to create the jobs, to build the houses, to feed the people, to heal the people. But it's too early to start seeing each other as competition. And we need to still be in that collaborative mind frame and look at the energy of the plant, which is one of, you know, it can provide so much. It is one of abundance, and stay with that energy for as long as we can, that you're like, there is a space for all. Find your niche, use your experience. What can you do better than anyone else, and stick with that, because that's actually a key bit of advice that I'd give, that we fell into as Emporium, what I call the hemp trap. You know, you're working with a plant that can do everything. It can make clothing, houses, food, medicine, the works. And once you get into that, you get so excited that you want to make everything. You know, you want to develop all these products. That's the exciting part, but you end up spreading yourself really thin, and you end up not doing anything to its highest good. So when you find that you're good at something and you've got a niche and you've got a gap, you just feed into that and you do it to the best of its ability, and you do it better than anyone else, and your customers will come, and your opportunity and your gap will come. And yeah, just keep, again, lobbying. You know, like, we need legislation change. We need enabling legislation, and supporting the people who are out there. You know, like, another highlight of my career was earlier this year, where I had the opportunity to go to the UN with Jules and Myrtle again, and to be there and play a small part in the role, you know, to get the ruling that we saw last week, and I know our impact on the South African government. We were one of the few representatives who voted yes on everything. You know, like, we got through to them. When we met with them 2 weeks before, they were going to vote no on everything. And we managed to change that through lobbying, through activism, through, you know, education, and it's all of our roles in this industry to keep educating up and down. You know, keep educating people who want to get in and don't know anything. Keep educating people who in positions of power. It's a crucial part, because you know, we're all learning, and at the same time, as soon as you learn, your responsibility is then to teach. So.
Perfect. Yeah, fully agreed for that lobbying effort, because it's that lobbying that is fundamental to this industry actually producing what I agree with your vision of good consumer, locally produced products. If we can get that right, if we can figure out the legislative frameworks, the collaboration to ensure that consumer products meet good standard and can be on local shelves and not sourced from internationally sourced isolate and then bottled or brought in as a finished product, perhaps. Those are the issues and fundamental things we need to address and lobby for. And I'd like to come back to the lobbying discussion, because I feel that this is an area that all of us can attest to being vital is this ability to unionize and lobby for the rights of the plant, the rights of access. But Phyllis Sunday, I wanted to bring you in as well, because I mean, being based out in the Eastern Cape, I've dealt with a lot of stakeholders in the region, you know, and I've noticed there's a very strong support from local government in the area, the provincial government in the area. Can you maybe speak to that briefly for just 2-3 minutes? Unfortunately, I see we're running a bit late on time, and I don't know if Paul or Sibs will be able to give us the additional time, but can you tell us a bit more about the developments in Eastern Cape?
Thanks again, Jeff. It's been an incredible journey, and especially the past 2 months since the introduction of the bill that has been floating around on social media. And one of our main worries was that it's not going to actually get to the people who are mostly affected by it. So our attention was immediately to lobby and talk to government and try and get them to be in the same picture as the rest of us, which has been a very frustrating a time for pretty much everybody within the cannabis industry because of this bill. And we were really, really lucky to have them listen to us and to say, okay, fine, what can we do to assist? Because they had started doing engagements whereby one of the agencies of the Department of Agriculture, which is now responsible for developing the framework for cannabis within that region, had started making engagements and talking to communities and promising that they can assist with resources and implements and so forth. But then we thought, hey, you're jumping the gun a little bit. How about you track back and give these local communities enough support with the legal battles and all of this before you can proceed and now give them all of the wonderful things like the seeds and different cultivars, which they don't really want, because the communities, the rural communities are also pretty freaked out about the fact that they now need to hold a license to cultivate the cannabis that they've had, that they've been cultivating, that they've known for all this while, and only to be exchanged for something else that is seemingly a lot cheaper to get into, but is very unknown. So we are saying, much as we want to develop all of these things and put in the hemp, industrial hemp within all of it, we're happy to do that, but we need to know exactly what we're getting ourselves into. We need for the communities to be aware what they're getting themselves into. Do they actually want to grow hemp next to their cannabis? How will everything affect each other in terms of genetic and all of these complicated issues around it? So I could say that we've been really lucky to have them finally just acknowledge that voice coming from the rural communities with the assistance of the traditional leaders, of course, who are also playing a major role in ensuring that there is a complete inclusion of the communities within the whole circle.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for that. And I agree. I mean, I'm very interested to see how agriculture is going to manage that, the space around hemp. And, you know, will it be as successful as perhaps the 2018 Farm Bill was in the US? There's a lot to discuss in that space. It's one where I almost don't want this webinar to end because I have so many questions, and I see the panel has so many questions. I mean, I still wanted to even get comments from Paul Michael from Schindler's on the private clubs, hear from all the panelists, you know, in terms of testing, in terms of processing. Should government be more involved in providing infrastructure? So if there's a local or provincial source for processing and extraction and for testing, would that be a way to increase inclusivity within the market space? I think we are running a bit tight on time, and I'd love to, I wish we had the hours longer to go, but to be respectful, I think maybe if we have some closing comments, I know that some of the panelists might have seen the chats as well. If you had any closing comments from your side that you would like to just share with, and Paul, perhaps I see you online as well, but if there's any closing comments from everyone, I'd love to hear your advice for everyone out there.
Maybe I can kick off. Look, I think we're living in a very special time in history, and sort of history of mankind. Having had such a strong relationship with this plants in almost every facet of life, and having prohibition as sort of a forced removal, a break, and now we're reconnecting. I think we all have a very unique and special role to play in what the future of this industry looks like, and how it impacts each and every single one of us, directly or indirectly. I think many people on this call are aspiring entrepreneurs, activists, consumers, growers, and so forth. And so I just compel it, our audience to dig deep. It's not an easy sort of process. It's not a straightforward industry, but I think the reward on the other side of that, in terms of impact, is tremendous if we can get it right at almost every level.
Thank you, Seb.
To just maybe echo a little bit of what some of the speakers were mentioning earlier on, especially what Tony is suggesting there of now focusing on creating a local market rather than looking into exporting or bringing in raw materials to get into the industry. And that collaboration, I think, is key. And rather than us seeing each other as competition, rather just finding means and ways of working together and creating a meaningful industry for ourselves, for South Africa, because I think there's enough need for cannabis, medical cannabis, as well as industrial cannabis to be developed and to circulate within the country. I think that's going to be key. And obviously, there's a lot to learn, and I think education is going to be key in it all. And I think that's where maybe government and as well as all of these lobbyist groups and activists are going to help in coming together and making an effort to conscientizing all of the country about what's ahead with the new industry.
Perfect. Maybe if I can jump in and ask Paul Michael to also maybe say something in this regard in the closing remark.
Yes, I mean, I think just leveraging off what I said initially in my presentation, and then also your concluding question around the cannabis private clubs. They're really a reaction to society interpreting what we call the spirit and the purport of the Constitutional Court judgment, reading between the lines. What was it that the Constitutional Court justices wanted to achieve? And it certainly would never have been to discriminate against people who either do not have sufficient private space or green enough fingers to grow cannabis. If they had been asked whether the rights that they afforded to us were limited to those who did have enough private space and had green enough fingers, they would have said, of course not, this is supposed to extend to everybody. So that's all that the private club does, is it's a mechanism for people to band together, pool their resources, and go to somebody, rent the space, and engage with the growing services and get their own cannabis back at the end. So I don't think it's anything contentious, despite the fact that the police continue to arrest and the prosecutors apparently continue to be keen to prosecute.
Thank you. Dr. Makwarela?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff. And I think from where I'm seated, I think a whole lot of things that are quite useful have been said. So it is very important that we keep this network. I think this is the beginning of greater things to come, in particular in Africa. And if you look at Africa as a whole, all governments are always talking about one thing: job creation. And I think this crop presents itself as a magnificent opportunity to create those kind of jobs and even increase the economies of African countries. Like, for instance, just looking at the basic step or the cultivation part of it, you have a lot of people in Africa who already understand the basic cultivation methods of the crop. that, it wouldn't be far-fetched, to involve a lot of communities in cultivating the crop. So governments must open up a bit more and allow people to come on board and even partner with those licensed companies that are already there, either even in the form of cooperatives involving both, young people and women in particular, because agriculture in the main has been proven to have these, job multiplier effects as opposed to different, industries. So I think it's high time that the crop is actually embraced in a manner that will allow multitude of jobs, to result as a way of exploiting the crop, and also partnering with those companies with, requisite skills, to actually, value adds, in terms of extractions and, isolations and all these kind of things that are a bit high-tech. So it's very important for me that the governments, in particular of Africa, can create all these interlinked value chains that they themselves can actually assist as catalysts and not prevent, people from exploiting the crop, notwithstanding the myriad opportunities that lie in the full, exploitation of the crop, against all these ailments and diseases that, all of us are trying to fight against. I think, in short, this is an opportune moment for governments, in particular in Africa, to begin to embrace and even catalyze the, utilization of the crop as a means of, increasing our economies. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Perfect, thank you. And from Tony?
Yeah, I just saw a comment from my fantastic friend Ricky Stone on the right there about the arbitrary definition of hemp and THC. And I have to agree with him. Hemp is a descriptive term for the industrial uses of the plant. It's not a different plant. It's not a arbitrary THC level. It means fiber and food and the non-psychoactive uses of the plant, and it includes some medicinal. There is medical hemp. So to get away from us trying to now meet the European or the North Americans 0.3 or 0.2 is crazy in Africa. There is going to always be a challenging climate here, and especially when you're bringing varieties that have only ever existed in, like the super long days of Finland, and trying to grow it here and think the THC is going to stay below 0.2. We need to look at our local genetics. We need to look at what we have here already, varieties that have learned how to grow here and not need all the inputs that any foreign genetic would need. So that's a big part. I see Wandile is on the call as well, and as a policy writer, to look at that at listing, at rather governing the end use of the plant, not the actual plant itself, and that would open up a lot. But the key again for the entrepreneur is just, again, I'm going to say it, just to understand. You've got to understand the difference between capex and opex. Make sure if you raise money, all any grower wants to do once he's got $1 million rand is go and spend 900,000 of it on a nice greenhouse, and you're not, that 100,000 that's left is not going to get you through your first harvest. Do not assume that your first harvest is going to be successful. Do not assume that you're going to sell your first harvest or even your second. It takes a while to reach economies of scale, to understand the systems that you're in place. And just because you've grown 100 plants for 10 years doesn't mean you understand how to grow 100,000 plants. So just to really understand scale, and bigger is not better. I'll say that again. And then just on a more, I suppose, existential level, I want to reclaim this word gateway. That cannabis is the gateway drug, but what it is the gateway to a more natural way of living, not a gateway to addiction or anything harder. And to remember that, why are we working with this plant in the first place? It can provide us with so many natural alternatives, from buildings to food to clothing to medicine, and to really hold that space that we're working with nature and we're working for nature. And I truly believe that those who work for nature, nature will look after. And if we're all servants of the plant, she will look after us. So she has for me. at least, and I think it's going to work for many others on this call and many others in Africa. So just really to hold that energy.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. So Bile, do you have a final remark before we close out for today's webinar? So Bile, I think you're on mute there quickly.
There I am. Yes, no, I just wanted to say I'm really grateful to have been part of this amazing panel, and everybody who has come through has given us such a wealth of knowledge. And I think it's still, I want to emphasize the importance of having proper data that we can use to set up this economy. And we really all need each other so much in this time, because I need to find out from everyone else in this sector what it is exactly that you need to find out on the ground, because it's vital for us to build this local market, and we can't do it without the actual people on the ground. We mustn't forget them. So yeah, based on that, thank you very much, everyone. It's been amazing.
Thank you so much. Well, I wish we wouldn't end. There's so much still I want to go through. But I think let's petition Paul and find out from Paul Rosen, who I'm sure will come up now, when we can hope to have the next session 2.0 and possibly 3.0, because I do think we need to assign more time to these discussions, because I think we're just cracking into it. I could do this all day, and I'm sure you can as well as a panel. And let's hear from Paul in closing, when hopefully we can do this again very soon.
Wonderful. All right. Well, if it was up to me, we would do this again in about 15 minutes, because we haven't even come close to scratching the surface. Let me just tell the group, all the panelists, all the speakers, and all our attendees that I don't think I've ever seen this amount of engagement on our chat button and our Q&A button. Not only do we have an engaged audience, but the level of the sophistication behind many of the questions and comments is next level. So ultimately, I'm going to talk for a few minutes here because my head is buzzing here, but let's start with the fact that this is a people business. We are as good as our ideas, our collaboration, and our execution. And the comment, it may have been Tony that said that right now we ought not to be thinking about competing amongst each other, is opposite to the highest degree. We're not here to beat each other down. What we need to do is engage in solidarity and build each other up. In a few years from now, when the African cannabis economy has hit scale, then you can get into the whole, knife fight in a phone booth, scorpions in a bottle of competing for market share. That's healthy, that's a free market. But right now we're competing against forces that are trying to impede the organic development of our industry. And we have to understand today, I don't like the word enemy, but today, if we are competing against anything, it's against outdated ideas and sluggish regulators that don't see the future that this plant can develop. And we need to show a professional, cohesive, industry, because it's a strong signal that adults and near adults like myself are involved in the day-to-day machinations of developing this industry. So this was incredibly stimulating, and we're going to do a third and a fourth and hopefully a fifth. It reinforces what I have believed for years now, which is that Africa is going to be a hub for the cannabis industry, not just for the local economy, but also, and for the local patients, but also for the global economy. Tony, let me just unequivocally confirm your observation that there is indeed no such thing as a magic Canadian. Sorry to my fellow comrades here. There was a brief period of time, though, where we were spreading our sort of cannabis fairy dust throughout the globe, and you're quite right that those sort of highfalutin, hysterical days are over. But we can learn a great deal of valuable information from countries that were early adapters into cannabis, such as Canada, where I'm located and where I came up in this industry. First and foremost, the lesson that we've learned from Canada and other jurisdictions like Colorado or Washington State in the United States that were early is, don't be afraid of this plant. Embrace it. All the predicted social harm that we were told was going to happen in Canada should we legalize cannabis, such as teenage use going up, it being a gateway drug in the old retrograde sense to other more dangerous narcotics, risk to drivers on the road because of so-called stone drivers, you know, straying out of their lane. We can say significantly the answers to those mythologies were did not happen, did not happen, did not happen. Instead, we can paint to meaningful societal benefits, including patient and customer safety. We actually have labeling and we know what's in the bottle these days. Oversight and authentication, which any industry that wants to have a CPG or even a medical component must have. Leading edge scientific research advancing efficacy and innovative formulations. Literally tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of good paying safe jobs encompassing multiple disciplines. Much needed taxes for depleted national and local treasuries. Maybe most importantly, the end of incarceration for cannabis users and a re-examination of the relationship between mental health and plant-based medications, starting with cannabis, but leading all the way to psychedelics. Our industry must not just talk about people, planet, and profit. It must have the discipline to live by that creed: people, planet, and then profits. So everything I heard today brings a smile to my face. Emerging Canada economies can study and fully embrace both proven best practices from jurisdictions like Canada, as well as a number of invalidated per corporate practices that did cause damage to our industry in Canada as we developed. Let's just chalk all this up to growing pains of an early stage industry, but still helpful case studies for emerging cannabis regulators and market participants in Africa will help construct a sustainable path moving forward, which in large part, sorry for the promotion, is exactly what Global Go does. Global Go, made up of some of the leading executives in our industry, is in a position to help identify for emerging cannabis operators and regulators what works, what does not work. Not for the big oligopoly companies, but for the entire list of stakeholders. I totally agree. There was a moment on the chat where someone had indicated we can't turn this into just another big business where smaller entrepreneurs and operators are not able to practice. The truth is that the cannabis industry is very capitally intensive. It's expensive, but we need to make sure that we develop programs in all countries that do not disadvantage smaller operators who should be a viable and sustainable part of the development of this industry. We're here to help. By we, I mean Global Go, but also all the other incredible panelists and content providers today. I'm sure everybody here, including myself, is available to anyone that may want to follow up with email, phone calls, WhatsApps, or Zooms. We're in the business of moving this industry forward. We're in the business of embracing sustainability and best practices, and we're in the business of empowering local, historically disadvantaged communities. I want to thank our speakers and our panelists and also our sponsors without whose contribution today would not have been valuable. Zuber Lawler, Del Duca, a law firm in Los Angeles that was recently awarded Cannabis Firm of the Year, the Social Surveys Institute, which we talked about, 7 Energy, Fields of Green for All, Hemporium, Schindler's, and Maludi Green Med. Thank you so much for your participation today. To our audience, it's all about you. Thank you for your engagement and look forward to everybody gathering again shortly. Until then, God bless and Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you.
Yes, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.